We were very, very badly shipwrecked. We were hit by an enormous wave. When I was thrown against the ceiling of the cabin and then against the wall of the cabin, I fractured my skull and broke my nose. And the boat was filling up with water. So we almost died.
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Life Uncut. I'm Brittany.
And I'm Laura.
And today is a guest that I am extremely excited about. Now, we all remember the Netflix hit Adolescence. Remember, it was number 1 on Netflix in 70 countries for 3 or 4 weeks. It was that series, if you missed it, that was all shot in like one long scene. Do you remember?
Everyone. It took over everything.
It took over everything. Well, I, along with literally the rest of the world, became obsessed with it. And whilst I was doing one of my deep dives on it one day, I saw that Jack Thorn, who was the writer of Adolescence, was adapting a biography of a new series. And so obviously I went down that rabbit hole and wanted to see what that was going to be because I thought it would be just as brilliant. And that is how I stumbled across our next guest. So today we're joined by Suzanne Heywood. Now, Suzanne is an author, a business leader, and a child survivor of a pretty extraordinary and scary life at sea. Suzanne spent nearly a decade, from age 7 to 17, living on board her parents' boat, Wavewalker. This was following her father's dream of recreating Captain Cook's third voyage. But what was meant to be only a 3-year family adventure ended up becoming this wild story of childhood captivity, for want of a better word. Suzanne was isolated, unable to receive a proper education, and at one point she spent weeks with a fractured skull that required multiple operations on this tiny island in the middle of the sea, and she didn't even have access to anaesthesia to go through that. So I just cannot imagine. She has survived shipwrecks, emotional neglect from her parents, and eventually battled her way to Oxford and a career at Cambridge, which is one of my favorite parts of the stories, which we're obviously going to get to because that is at the end. But Suzanne, I'm so excited to talk to you today. Welcome to Life Uncut.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Suzanne, the story that you have to share it's such a huge story and also spans over so many years. But what was your life like prior to your dad having this idea of going out and, going on this boat? What was it like your childhood prior to that time?
See, my recollection of my childhood prior to that time, it was very normal. So we were living in a house in England, living in a town called Warwick, which is right in the middle of the UK. We were living quite a kind of nice life. My mother was a teacher. My father was running a hotel that he'd set up and doing various other kind of bits and pieces. I was going to a little local school. I remember I was learning how to ride a horse. I was learning how to play the violin. Not very well, as I recall, but there we go. I had various friends. I had a very beloved dog called Rusty, who was a water spaniel. So a very normal childhood, really.
And then your dad comes out of nowhere in a way and says, we're going to go around the world to sea on a boat for a couple of years? Or was he an avid sailor? Like, how did this come about?
So my dad was a keen sailor. He used to go out sailing with friends on the weekends. He didn't go very far. He occasionally went across the channel. And then he suddenly announced, I've got this great idea. We're going to sail around the world following Captain Cook. And I should explain that my maiden name is Cook. So he had always been a kind of fan of Captain Cook. It was his name. We're not actually related, by the way. I grew up thinking that we were, but I now know that we're not.
You did an ancestry test.
Well, all Captain Cook's children died without heir. But the idea was that we were going to follow Captain Cook around the world and recreate, more specifically, his third voyage. So we were going to set sail on the exact anniversary of Captain Cook's third voyage, and we were going to sail around the world. But it was going to be a 3-year adventure. So we're going to set sail when I was 7. We're going to be back by the time I was 10. Everything would go back to normal. I'd go back to school. Rusty, my dog, would be waiting for me. My doll's house, which was my favorite toy, would be waiting in my grandfather's attic. It would all be there when we came back.
It also sounds so incredibly exciting when you say it like that and you think, there's parents these days who take their kids out of school for X amount of time and they go sailing. It sounds magical. And in your situation and what unfolded was anything but that. What was it like when your dad said, okay, this is what we're doing? Was the reaction from the whole family excitement? Was it enthusiastic? Were you nervous about it? What was that time like?
I remember having quite mixed feelings. I mean, like many little girls, I hero worship my dad. I thought my dad could do anything. And my dad is a bit of a polymath. He can do anything. So I absolutely was going to go on this thing. And anyway, I was 7 years old. You don't question your parents. at that
Totally.
point.
You didn't have a choice anyway.
You don't really have a choice, which is one of the things that we might come back to. Kids just don't have a choice. On the other hand, I also remember being really upset about leaving my best friend behind, my dog, and my doll's house in particular. Those were the three things that I really regretted. And I remember crying a lot about that. So it was a kind of mixed experience, but there was never any question that I would go. And also that my younger brother, who was 6, 1 year younger than me, would go as well.
And so the family was you and your brother, your dad and your mum. How did your mum feel about this? Was she also a sailor? Because I feel like it's a pretty big endeavor to say for like, you know, a weekend sailor, a sometimes sailor that dabbles in it, to say I am going to take my family that involves small children around the world alone for a year. Like that is a pretty big undertaking.
So my mother never expressed any doubt at that point in front of us that I can recall. There was a bit of a discussion about how we were going to get schooling, which they were very laid back about. I was worried about that a little bit because I love school, actually. I was quite a kind of academic child. And so there was a promise that my mother, who was a school teacher, was going to kind of bring worksheets and that would all be absolutely fine. I don't remember at that point my mother expressing concern, although I already knew that my mother was not a keen sailor. So my father was the sailor and my mother never was the sailor.
What was normal day-to-day life like when you had actually, you know, you transported your life, you're now on this boat. What was it like at the start of this journey?
Well, it was a shock, to be honest, because we get on this boat and it's, as you said, it's my mother and my father and my brother and me. We have 3 crew on board at the start of the boat because she's quite a big boat. She's 69 feet long, very narrow, quite old-fashioned looking. So we needed some crew to help sail it. One of the crew actually had some sailing experience, which was very helpful because my father had never actually crossed an
I should
ocean.
hope so.
So Owen, one of the crew, actually had crossed an ocean before, so that was quite helpful as well. But what was a shock is we got out to sea. My mother went to bed because it turns out my mother gets very badly seasick. So she went to bed and she disappeared for several days. And my brother and I basically left on our own, age 7 and 6, in the main cabin. They kind of tossed around because what happens at sea is the adults, if they're not ill, like my mother would be for kind of several days every time we went to sea, they would either be up on deck on watch or they'd be asleep in their bunks. So as kids, you're kind of left on your own in the middle, kind of in the main cabin, and quickly, you know, working out that every time a wave hits the deck, lots of salt water comes down below. So there's places to sit, places not to sit, trying to work out what you can do all day, you know, in a world where it's just you and your brother and you're just sitting in this cabin, not allowed up on deck because it was very stormy, at least for the first few days at sea.
I mean, even when you describe the first week or so on this boat, it feels, I understand that with bad weather and everything else, your parents probably had to be doing what they needed in order to keep everyone safe. But it also feels like it started off quite negligible. In terms of your, and we might be jumping ahead here a little bit, but in terms of your perspective, and as a child, you don't really understand what's going on. You don't really comprehend that maybe the behavior of my parents isn't appropriate. We seem to do the therapy work afterwards and put those pieces together. But how old were you when you started to realize this is not okay? Like, this is not how a child should be treated or behave, or like when was it that you started putting the pieces together that this wasn't an acceptable life?
It was a lot later, actually. I think it was in my early teens that I really started to rebel. And really it was after Hawaii, after we had the vote, which we will come to. That was a kind of pivot moment for me on the voyage, because that was the point at which I knew beyond all doubt that I was there against my will. So early on, you just kind of accept what that world is like. But this wasn't a pleasure cruise. The first voyage that we had was from the UK all the way down to South America. And that is a 6-7 week trip at sea. We stopped kind of briefly up Madeira and the Canary Islands, but then 6-7 weeks at sea. So you're not seeing anyone for 6 or 7 weeks. We're before the internet, so you've got no contact with anybody. By the time we got to South America, we were quite severely short of food. It's not a kind of fun experience to put a kid through, really. Now, kids are incredibly resilient. So my brother and I eventually kind of figured out various games we could play. We made a kind of kingdom with our stuffed animals. And, I remember particularly in kind of later years, creating an entire imaginary world out of a chess set. So each of the kind of pieces on the chess set had a kind of character, and it was an entire kind of kingdom. But you're doing this out of desperation because you just don't have very much, to do on the boat.
Well, there's no stimulation.
What would a typical day look like for you? I know there's probably not a typical, I guess, in a way, if there's storms and you're facing all these different kinds of adversity. But you said your mum was a school teacher. Did she come prepared with things to teach you? Was she too sick to teach you? Like, what were you doing all day for 7 weeks at a time?
So on that first voyage, we were just trying to entertain ourselves and kind of subsist, really. My mother, the teaching was very occasional, I have to say. Every so often, my mother would produce a worksheet and kind of hand it to us. And even early on, I remember quite a lot of tension between myself and my mother because, my style of learning is that I question a lot. So I would kind of get a worksheet on the kind of rare occasions when she would give us one. And I'd want to ask questions about it, kind of why, why is this like this? And, why is this type of kind of maths like this and this one? And she got very frustrated at that. She didn't want to do that. She wanted to kind of just give us something and then she would get on with what she was doing and, not really engage with us about it. So that was always a great source of tension and didn't really work very well between me and my mother, just the kind of way in which I learned. But otherwise, we would get up in the morning, we would forage around a bit because there wouldn't be any adults around because they're up on deck or they're in their bunks. So we would forage around a bit to see what we could find for kind of breakfast. At some point, if it wasn't too stormy, an adult would appear around lunchtime and there might be some food that was prepared, and the same around kind of dinner time. Otherwise, you were on your own, trying to figure out what you could do, with your kind of stuffed animals and kind of other bit. If the weather became much better, which it did after we passed the equator, after 3 or 4 weeks, then we could occasionally go up on deck. So most of the time you see you're trapped down below. You're not even up, you don't even see the light because you're down below. And then we were allowed on deck for kind of brief periods of time. We could sit on deck, which was, huge release, as you can imagine. And I should explain for those listeners who are not sailors, we were sailing the wrong way around the world. So most people who sail around the world sail from east to west. And if you sail from east to west, you can sail around near the equator. And generally the winds are pretty good and it's not a bad sail most of the time, as long as you time it well. We were sailing the other way. We were sailing from west to east because that was where Captain Cook went. And we were following Captain Cook. And what I hadn't understood when my father announced we were going to follow Captain Cook on his third voyage is we were following an incredibly dangerous route. Because to sail from west to east, you've got to go very, very far south. So we went all the way down to South America, to Rio, and then crossed the very southern Atlantic Ocean, which was a very stormy crossing. And then we had to cross the southern Indian Ocean, which is probably one of the most dangerous bits of ocean in the world.
How do you, and we are jumping around here, but how do you reconcile as an adult that, when you understand more the danger that your father chose to put you in? Because it's one thing to be circumnavigating the world, in the safest way possible, but it's another to actively choose to go the direction that nobody goes, knowing it's going to put yourself and your family in direct danger. Like, how do you grapple with that as an adult?
I find it very difficult. I just don't understand. And I'm now a parent myself. I have 3 children. I don't understand the thought process that makes you think. So I understand the thought process of this is a great adventure and I'm excited about the adventure. There are people in the world who just love doing that. They see a mountain and they want to climb it. They see an ocean, they want to cross it. And that's great. You can take a decision as an adult to put your own life at risk. But to take a decision as an adult to put the lives of small children in known risk. We were sailing on our own. We weren't sailing in a flotilla with other boats. We had very limited safety equipment on board. That decision I just find incomprehensible. And I find it incomprehensible today. And actually, it was the point at which my children became a similar age to the age I'd been when I'd been on Wavewalker that I started to write, because that was the point where something inside my head kind of clicked and I went, this just doesn't make any sense. I just don't understand the decisions here that were made.
What ended up happening at the 3-year mark? I mean, that's what was promised to you originally. You think you're going back to your life, to your dollhouse, to your dog, and then 3 years comes and goes and it's far from the case. Was there a discussion with you about it, or was it just an expectation that we're going to keep on going?
Well, you see, what had happened by the time we got to 3 years is we were shipwrecked on that second very difficult voyage. So after we went from South America to South Africa, on that voyage from South Africa to Australia, we were very, very badly shipwrecked. We were hit by an enormous wave, which my father, who'd been up on the wheel, he looked behind himself and saw something that he described as being 3 times as big as our mainmast, a huge wave, which crashed over the boat, went through the center of the deck, outside the, and then through the hull. And I, as a little girl, still 7 years old, had been standing below, and I was thrown against the ceiling of the cabin and then against the wall of the cabin, and I fractured my skull and broke my nose. And the boat was filling up with water.
Oh my
So we
God.
almost died. Yeah, we almost died. We were incredibly lucky to find a tiny little atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean called Amsterdam. And we found it 3 days later. And I say incredibly lucky because we were in a storm and you can't take, the only navigation we had on board was a sextant, which is a very old fashioned piece of equipment where you basically measure the angle between the sun or a star and the horizon, which obviously you can't do in a storm. So we didn't know where we were. So my father guessed where we were. We found this atoll 3 days later. We wouldn't have stayed afloat long enough to get to Australia. So it was a very, very kind of close thing. And then when we found this atoll, because I was so badly injured with this kind of skull fracture with a big blood clot on the brain, I had all of these head operations on this island, which didn't have suitable anesthetic for a kind of 7-year-old. So they were all done without anesthetic. And all done on my own as well, because my mother didn't come in because she doesn't like the sight of blood. So I did all of those on my own.
Suzanne, we need to wind it back here because that is one of the most wild stories I've ever heard. Okay, you've got a fractured skull and a broken nose. Was your family aware of how injured you were?
Yeah, I had an absolutely massive kind of lump on my head. And, one of the shocking things actually about writing the book was a lot of what happened on the boat, I'd kind of packed away in the back of my head, and then I got on with my life because I just wanted to move forward. And it was only when I stopped and wrote the book that I then tried to gather every piece of kind of documentation that I could find about what had happened. And one of the things that I managed to get hold of and take a copy was my mother's diary. And my mother's diary, when I read it, was really quite kind of sobering because my parents always tried to kind of play down my injury. I remember it being horrific. I have really kind of horrific, kind of jagged memories of what happened in that time, in that accident. But reading my mother's diary, which she wrote kind of at the time, in fact, she kind of wrote it on the island, all the bits up to it, it is equally horrific. Because she talks about my head being deformed and my huge swelling and me screaming in pain and all of this. So I now know that what I remember, those kind of jagged bits of memory in my head, are actually kind of correct. But I packed a lot of that away for a long time. And as I say, my parents then kind of played it down for years in my childhood. And I now know that a lot of what happened, and this is one of the kind of difficult things about this, is when you grew up on a boat, particularly for such a long period of time, it's a little bit like growing up in a cult. There was a particular philosophy about why we were there, what we were doing. We were following Captain Cook. It was a kind of grand and noble purpose. My father was a fantastic sailor. What happened in the Indian Ocean, that was a one-off. And anyway, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
My father later wrote that I got away lightly from the accident. There was just this ongoing attempt to kind of play everything down.
Okay, so you're in this tiny island in the Indian Ocean that you've stumbled across. How did it come about that there was a doctor there that was able to operate on you? Was this just by chance? What kind of a doctor was he, if you remember? And what kind of operations was he performing on you without anaesthesia?
So on Amsterdam, there's this tiny scientific base. And people can look it up, actually. It's quite interesting. They have about every 12 months, they drop off another team of scientists and they take the last team of scientists off. And there's a group of it's about 20. It was all men when we were there. I don't know whether it's now kind of more mixed. And they are doing, weather testing and various other things on this tiny atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I think it's a very interesting place to be. And they do have a doctor on the team. But the medical facilities, as you can imagine, are very limited because you're really just trying to deal with what might happen for 20 men on an island doing science experiments. They're not geared up to do major operations. Since the book came out, I've actually been able to, when I was writing the book, I was able to correspond with the doctor who operated on me. He didn't speak very good English. So this was, I'm afraid, Google Translate kind of emails back and forth. Since the book came out, and the book has recently come out in French, I've been approached by somebody called Pierre, and it's been a little bit in the newspapers. And Pierre was actually present during the operations and is a little bit younger. And he has explained to me, it's funny how these little facts of your background start to kind of come together. Because one of my big questions was, why didn't you give me anesthetic? Because what they had to do is they had to cut open my head, not through the bone, but on top, to release this pressure, the kind of massive blood clot that I had on the brain. And it was such a huge swelling. They had to do 6-7 operations to relieve the swelling. And you can imagine somebody cutting into a massive swelling on your head 6-7 times. I'm screaming with pain. And repeatedly screaming, I have to say, the only French swear word I knew, because the doctor spoke French and not English, and I couldn't speak French. So we were, and I was on my own because, as I said, my mother didn't want to come in, and she said she didn't like the sight of blood, which, by the way, is an indication which became kind of clearer as I grew up. My mother was never a very maternal person because, frankly, one of my kids had been in that situation. I would have been there, even if I blindfolded myself, I would have been there.
Yeah.
So Pierre said the reason why they didn't give me any anesthetic is they did have some general anesthetic, but they had no way of working out the dose for a 7-year-old. And they thought if they tried to give me it, they could, they could easily kind of kill me. And then they had some local anesthetic, but when they tried that, they discovered it wasn't working. So the net result was I had no anesthetic.
How did your parents, so at this time, obviously they've gone through all of this. How long did you end up spending on the island in total before you were able to set sail again? How long was that?
So my father was on the island, I think, for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then he set sail again with the crew. He'd done some very basic patching up of the boat. The very limited facilities on this island. It's basically a volcanic atoll in the middle of nowhere. So he'd nailed some bits of steel over the hole in the side of the boat and on the deck. But, the boat was still very badly damaged. So my brother, my mother and I were banned from going back on board by the French and the British government because they said this is just too dangerous for you to go back on board. So it was several weeks later when a passing cargo ship came by, and my brother and my mother and I were basically kind of rescued from this island. It was a very dramatic rescue, actually, because we were taken out in the little supply ship that the island had, because it happened to be at the moment when they were bringing in more supplies. And then we transferred at sea across this cargo ship. And I remember clinging onto the ladder. It was like one of these electric ladders going up the side of this container ship, which is, they're huge. They're like 20 stories high. But anyway, we got to Fremantle and met up with my dad. And then we were in Fremantle for about a year, during which I got to go to school briefly, which was fantastic. I love that. Going to school in Fremantle. I remember making friends. I remember being able to learn an instrument. I've always loved music, so I remember doing that, which of course is not something I could do very easily on the boat, although later on I taught myself the guitar. So that was great. But then, of course, my father wanted to keep sailing. So we kept sailing. We went round the kind of bight of Australia, up to Melbourne, and then up to Sydney. We sailed in the Sydney Hobart, but not officially, down to Tasmania.
Not officially, just tacked on.
Well, yes. My father decided he could, he either didn't want to pay for, or he couldn't enter the race officially. So, but he decided it'd be fun to sail with it. So the only issue was he couldn't get a chart. So he sailed based on the map that he managed to get on the back of a bar mat. So that was,
oh my God.
He sailed the Sydney Hobart.
Your dad is a cowboy, a wild cowboy.
Yeah, complete cowboy.
What was happening with your parents' relationship at the time? Was there a point where your mum's perspective changed on wanting to be on the boat, or whether she verbalized that she didn't want to be there, or was she quite willing for this whole experience?
So my mother was always very clear that she hated sailing. And she said that a lot. And every time we left port, she would go to bed for 3 days. And nobody was allowed to bother her. She would just kind of go to her bed and that was it. You know, she also used to suffer from migraines and kind of go to bed as well. You know, so my mother would disappear a lot at sea. You know, I just got used to as a kid, my mum would not be around for quite a lot of time when we were at sea. She always hated that. On the other hand, my parents' relationship is very close. And somebody once gave me a kind of quote, I don't know where it came from, but it kind of summed up my childhood. And the quote is, "The child of lovers is an orphan." And it felt like that. You know, on the boat, the kind of key relationship was between my parents. And my brother and I were really quite tangential to that. You know, we were along for the trip, but it wasn't about us at all.
As you grew up and you became a little bit more self-aware and you got smaller levels of education here and there, which we'll chat about, what were the roles that were laid upon you and your brother, and how did they start to differ with age?
Yeah, they really did. And really it started to kind of change after Hawaii. So we went all the way up the Pacific from there to Hawaii. And that was the moment where everything changed, because we got to 4 years. The voyage was supposed to have been 3 years, but it was 4 years to get there because of the shipwreck and the year spent repairing the boat in Fremantle. And my father had always promised, and this was always a premise of the voyage, that the voyage was something that we were all doing together, that we all wanted to do. Now, of course, I now know that this is completely false. You know, a child of 7 can't decide to do this. You have no choice. You have to do it. And there'd also been a decision to keep going in Fremantle. But again, I was 8 years old, so you don't really have a choice. By the time we got to Hawaii, so we're 4 years in, and then we stayed in Hawaii for about a year and a half, I was 11, 12. And I desperately wanted to go back to the UK, or frankly, anywhere where I could settle and go to school and have friends. I was desperate to get an education. I was desperate to have friendships, do all the normal things that a kind of teenage girl would do. And, you know, living in that sort of environment is a bit like being in a cult. You know, what my father said was what we were all supposed to believe. And my father was the captain, which is a bit like being the kind of king. And so we had to vote. And I voted to come home, and my brother voted to come home, and my parents both voted to keep sailing. And then at the end of all of this, my dad took another swig of rum. My parents were very heavy drinkers, as kind of goes with a lot of sailors. And he said, "Well, you know, what I didn't tell you is that this isn't a democracy. This is a kind of benevolent dictatorship, and the captain always gets the final vote. And I'm voting that we keep sailing." And I remember being completely shocked, because when you grow up in that kind of cult-like situation, you accept the kind of doctrines of it, and then all of a sudden it's turned on its head, and you realize that was never true. That was never true. It was never true. It was only true while I agreed. At the point at which I disagreed, it became untrue. And then from that moment onwards, of course, I knew that I was there against my will. You know, we turned the boat around, we sailed back down to Australia, but I was never there by my own choice. You know, the vote, in a way, which was a conceit that my father has, I now realize as an adult, to kind of legitimize everything, you know, where you can't complain about it because you decided to be here, suddenly kind of blew up, because when it didn't work, the opposite happened in my head anyway, which was I never chose to be here. I was very clear I didn't want to be here, and my kind of choice was overridden. And my relationship with my mother was deteriorating really quite badly. My mother and I had a very difficult relationship, which got really bad after I got to kind of early teens. And I, to this day, don't know why she was so kind of unpleasant to me, is the only way of describing it. I mean, she would not speak to me for kind of days, sometimes weeks on end on the boat. She would call me names. She refused. I mean, little things that, you know, now seem quite small, but at the time were very big. Like she refused ever to buy me a bra because, and, you know, she would kind of mock me. And, you know, but those are very big things when you're living in a tiny space and you don't have anybody else to go to.
But it's not even, I mean, even a part of me now, and forgive me, but it even sounds like there's a part of you still downplaying it a little bit. Like, they are pretty huge things for the person that's supposed to be raising you and looking after you and caring for you. And not only that, but they are the only point of contact that you have. Like, you are below deck with no sunlight. That is your only person. Not only is it supposed to be your carer, but it's the only person that is belittling you and mocking you. It almost sounds like maybe she was resentful of you both, you know, having children, and maybe it's impacted her life. I don't know. Is that how you feel?
So the relationship she had with my brother was very different to the relationship with me. And this kind of plays into the question you were asking about the kind of different genders on board. So the way in which it kind of played out is my brother was allowed to be on deck and was allowed to sail. He enjoyed doing that, and he was celebrated as doing that, you know, and he became a very kind of golden child. My brother could do no wrong. He was the kind of one who was kind of strong and on deck. And my role as a girl was I was expected to be down below, helping my mother cook and clean. And by this point, we'd run completely out of money. We never had a huge amount of money, but we'd run completely out of money. And my father started taking crew on board who were paying us to come on board. So it became a bit like a floating hotel. So therefore, they had to be cooked for and cleaned for. And usually they were men. So I'm a kind of teenage girl. We've got kind of multiple male crew on board. I'm sharing a cabin with them. I don't have my own cabin. There's only one working head or toilet, as they called it. So you're in very kind of confined, and I'm expected to go to work down below 6-7 hours a day, kind of cooking and cleaning. And my relationship with my mother is completely different to her relationship with my brother. And I think a lot of it, frankly, if I look back as an adult now and having done a little bit of kind of therapy around this to try and understand her and me, I think a lot of it was jealousy. You know, I was a very academic child. My mother was not very academic. I was becoming a very pretty teenager. You know, my mother was at a point in her life where I don't know whether she was feeling insecure about that. I had a very good relationship superficially with my dad. I say superficially because we got on very well, but I mean, that was on his terms, so long as I didn't challenge the kind of thesis of the voyage or anything like that. And that was her only relationship. So maybe she was jealous of that as well. I, to be honest, I don't know. I'm hypothesizing. But, you know, all of these things led to a very difficult relationship. You know, she was very emotionally abusive to me. In today's, I would never use that language as a child, but I would now say that. I saw another parent doing it to another little girl. That's what I would call it.
Suzanne, at what point was it that you really realized how dysfunctional it was that you were, like, the life you were living and the relationship that you had with your parents? And I guess, like, the unpacking of this sense of being held captive against your will in a situation that you had no ability to consent to.
It was only afterwards, to be completely honest, because when you're in that situation, and it went on for years, when you're in that situation, first of all, you've got nothing to compare it to, and you don't have anyone to talk to because I'm kind of trapped on this boat. So who are you going to talk to? And it's also very difficult, as it's been kind of explained to me since, it's very difficult for a child to challenge their parents, because even inside your own head, because if you challenge your parents and you decide that your parents are not good parents, where does that leave you? And particularly, where does that leave you if you're kind of stuck on a boat with them? You know, you've got nowhere else to go. So actually, it was only as an adult, once I'd kind of formed my own world, you know, I've got my own family, I've got my own kids, I was able to look back, and now I'm very kind of critical of what they did and how they treated me. At the time, I didn't get into any of that. At the time, my only focus was on how am I going to get out of here? I don't like where I am. I kind of accept it's just as it is. And maybe my parents are just like everybody else's parents, just a little bit more extreme. I kind of knew they were more extreme. My main focus is getting out of here because I don't like this world.
In saying that as well, you know, when you talk about like how other kids might think that their parents are extreme, when you have literally no reference point because you don't have the stability of friendships, you don't have the stability of aunts and uncles or other friends' parents.
Well, there's no internet
to do the
either.
comparison. Yeah. And the smaller your world is, the more that world is normal to you because as a child, because there's no reference point for anything else. There's so much more to your story in terms of like when you left, how did you escape that situation? How did your parents respond to it? But what age were you when you decided I'm not going to stay here anymore? And how did your mum and dad react to that?
So I never told them that in that way. What I decided inside my own head was I was going to try and educate myself off this boat because I couldn't think of any other way to get out of it. I mean, I hadn't spoken to or had any contact of any sort with any of my relatives since we left England. For a long time, I didn't even have my own passport. I was just on my parents' passport. I had no money. The little bit of money I earned at various points babysitting, my father would take from me because he would say, okay, well, we need that money to run the boat. So you need to kind of give us that money. And he wouldn't kind of give it back. So I had almost no autonomy. But the one thing I decided I could do was to educate myself because I managed to convince my parents to let me register with a correspondence school, actually the kind of Queensland Secondary Correspondence School, as it was then called. And I started working on this in the bits and pieces of time that I had. Now, I didn't have a lot of time because I was expected to work, cooking and cleaning on this boat. And my mother hated me studying to the point where she would actively try to, disrupt me. So I would be sitting, there was one little table on the boat that only sat kind of 4 or 5 people. So you'd have to fight for a place with the crew. And my mother would come in and turn the radio up to full volume if she saw me studying. And then I would say, Mum, I can't study. So I'd turn it down and then she would come and turn it back up again. She would play this game. And again, kind of looking back, I can't quite understand why, apart from if I was doing that, I wasn't working, doing stuff she wanted. I think she did find it threatening somehow that I had this thing that I was doing that wasn't kind of hers. And she just didn't really like me. I mean, it was just as basic as that. And that bit I did understood. Even as a child, I knew that she didn't like me.
That's so sad.
But I still kept on studying.
How did it end up being your escape route? You said you wanted to educate your way off the boat. How did that come into fruition?
So the final stage is that we got to New Zealand, by which point my parents were worried about my brother's education. My brother, as I say, was always the kind of golden child in our family. And he wasn't studying. He gave up studying. And I don't blame him at all for that. It was almost impossible to study on the boat. But they were very worried about that, unlike kind of me, because as my father would say to me, your brother, when he grows up, he needs to support a family and you won't. So, we need to worry about his education. So they left my brother in New Zealand and he was 15 and they left me looking after him age 16 and they kept sailing. They left us behind. So we were basically abandoned in New Zealand. I was left as kind of caregiver to my brother and he was going to school. I wasn't going to school. I was still trying to teach myself and then look after him. And in the book, that is the most difficult chapter. Although I have to say it's the dawn before, it's the darkest part of the night before the dawn, because after that it gets a lot better. But that is very difficult. I've become very depressed. I just can't cope. I remember ringing up Childline and, I just couldn't kind of deal with being left all on my own with no adults at all in New Zealand, trying to kind of cope as an adult when I was only 16.
I can't even fathom it. I just cannot fathom. But at a time where there's no internet, you're 16, you're in a foreign country with nobody, you haven't had the proper education. Where were you living? How were you physically surviving?
So my father had hired a little holiday hut or batch, as they're called in New Zealand. And we were living in that, but it was incredibly basic. It gets pretty cold. We were in Rotorua in the centre of North Island and it gets really cold. And I remember getting this guy to come and bring me some logs of wood, which I was chopping up to try and kind of get this little burner to work. So that was very basic. We didn't have a kind of washing machine or anything like that. So I had a very clapped out car that my father had also left behind that I was driving into Rotorua, which is about 40 minutes away, to try and do the washing and get kind of food. He'd left a very small amount of money. My father was always very difficult about money. He'd left a very small amount of money in a bank account separate to his bank account, which I could access. But because I was so young in New Zealand at the time, you couldn't have an account before you were 18. So I could only access it by forging his signature.
Oh my God.
One way or another, I was making do, but it was very difficult. But as I say, that was the kind of darkest point before the light, because I then wrote from that hut in New Zealand to every university I'd ever heard of in the world. I made up the addresses because I had no way of finding the addresses. So I wrote to, Oxford University, Oxford, England, and Cambridge University, and Sydney, and Auckland, and London, and Harvard, and a lot of the elite universities, not because I thought I was elite, but they were just the only universities I'd ever heard of. And in all of them, I kind of wrote the same thing. I said I'd kind of grown up on a boat. I hadn't really been to school. I'd taught myself, and I really wanted to come and study zoology, and would they at least consider me? And most of them wrote back and said, well, they either didn't write back because the address was wrong. Turns out Harvard University is not in Harvard.
But also, what else are you supposed to do? Like, you'd think that somebody would see Harvard and deliver it to Harvard.
Well, yeah, maybe they got it and they didn't reply. But anyway, they didn't reply. I do now know it was the wrong address. Quite a lot of other places wrote back and said no. So Sydney wrote back and said no because you're not Australian. You've only got a British passport. In fact, I was illegally in New Zealand, and they tried to deport me twice during this year because my parents didn't leave me on a proper visa. So they kept on trying to deport me. So Auckland wrote back and said I couldn't go there either. Most of the British universities wrote back and said no. And then incredibly, Oxford wrote back and said, well, write us a couple of essays. And then I wrote them a couple of essays. And then they said, well, if you can get here, we'll interview you. So I went and picked kiwi fruit, which was the only way in which I could earn any money because I was illegal. So, you can't cut it. And got myself enough money for a plane ticket and came back to the UK, did that interview, and incredibly, they offered me a place. And it completely turned my life around.
Did your parents ever face any sort of repercussions for firstly leaving you or for how they raised you? Like, was there ever any intervention or anything for this?
No. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book is it shocks me looking back that there never was any intervention. I mean, even when they tried to deport me in New Zealand because I turned up and I tried to get my visa renewed and they said not without a parent. And then I managed to get my father to come down from on the boat. He came down for like 2 days, turned up. Then they saw him, they stamped the passport. I mean, nobody ever asked any questions. Nobody ever asked any questions when we arrived in a port. What are these kind of kids doing on board? I don't remember anybody ever intervening. And when my parents came back to the UK, of course, they celebrated. This was a kind of great achievement. They'd kind of done this big voyage. My father wrote a book about the first year and a half where he's the kind of hero of the whole story. So no repercussions whatsoever. And nor have they ever wanted to talk about it.
I feel like your entry into university is quite remarkable and we probably brushed over it a little bit too quickly. But do you remember the essay that you wrote to Oxford to get into Oxford? Was it about your story or what was it?
Yeah, I've still got the essays. I wrote 2 essays. I thought about it quite a lot. And the one person, by the way, who was helping me is a wonderful teacher that I had at the correspondence school, a guy called Roger Wooler. He was my biology teacher at the correspondence school. And it's an amazing story for me anyway, because I'd never met him, because my father always refused to go to the school to kind of let me meet my teachers, because that would have been, would have taken time out and he would have had to have inconvenienced himself. But I did go and find Roger. When I was writing the book, I went back as an adult and found Roger. And I discovered, which I'd never known, that kind of Roger suffered from polio as a child and was in a wheelchair. And that was why he was teaching at the school. But he was a wonderful teacher. And he, for example, sent me books when I was in New Zealand that weren't actually part of the course, but he just found them and sent them to me. And he also was the one person I could talk to about things like, what were these essays going to be? I decided I had to write 2 essays that were different to what anybody else would write. So I was trying to apply to read biology. So I decided if I wrote something like the discovery of DNA, how was I going to compete with somebody who was at a school and they could go to a library and they could read books about it and they could get their teacher to help them with it? It'd be impossible. So my essays had to be different. So one was called Science at Sea. And it was basically describing how I tried to teach myself science whilst living at sea. So, for example, I had to do one dissection for my senior biology course, which involved me actually trying to catch a frog on an island in order to dissect it. So that was, I figured nobody else was going to write that one. And then the other one was just very obscure. It was basically an essay about whether or not humans are a domesticated species. So a bit like kind of dogs, their ancestry is wolves and then they became domesticated. Have we domesticated ourselves as a species? And I just thought that was, and I think it was originally suggested by Roger, I just thought that was an obscure enough and intriguing enough topic that nobody else was going to write about it. And it worked.
There's so many lessons in this. I mean, one, shoot your shot. Anything is possible. I feel like that's a really obvious lesson to come out of your side of the story. But there's something that gives me goosebumps, makes me emotional to think about just how much Oxford going out on a limb and giving somebody a shot that, for want of a better word, might not have deserved a spot at Oxford because they weren't as well educated. But the fact that they did and they took a risk on someone literally changed the course of the rest of your life. What is your relationship like now with your parents and your brother?
My mum died in 2016. And by that point, my parents knew that I was writing the book because I started writing the book back in 2015. And she was very angry that I was writing. I mean, she always refused to talk about it with me. At one point, she'd kind of come up to London to have lunch with me, which, by the way, was an unheard of event. I mean, my mother never asked to talk to me on my own. And she'd confronted me with, what was it that you didn't like about your childhood? And I said, well, the fact that you didn't talk to me for weeks on end and I wasn't able to get an education and then you abandoned me in New Zealand. And she kind of stomped off, refusing to kind of talk about any of it. And then she very sadly kind of suddenly died in 2016. Leaving me a very unpleasant letter, which I found kind of afterwards, which was very accusatory. This was all my fault. I was a miserable child and, I should be grateful for my kind of privileged childhood. And, it was actually, an unbelievably unpleasant letter. It was a lot more unpleasant than that. Kind of claiming there was a lovely woman in New Zealand, actually. Her name was Pam Crane, and she looked after me. Right at the end, just before I went to Oxford, I had to go up to Auckland to sit my final exams with the correspondence school. And she took me in for 2 weeks and looked after me. And she told me afterwards, as I just looked, I looked close to collapse. I hadn't really eaten a lot for a long time. I was very tired because, of course, the thing is, if you're working on your own, you've got no one to compare yourself to. So you don't know when to stop. So I just kind of kept on going. And I was in a terrible state, and she just kind of took me in, and she was wonderful. So my mother in this letter said, Pam Crane always disliked you. I mean, it was a very unpleasant letter, to the point where I actually remember ringing up. Sadly, Pam died, so she wasn't alive at the time, but I rang up her son who said, no, it's a complete lie. Pam loved you. So that was my mum. And then my father, we kind of patched things up a little bit. He was also angry that I was writing, also refused to ever talk to me about it, also refused to read copies of the book. But he turned up in 2019, and I should say I was widowed in 2018. So I'm a kind of widow by this point, with kind of 3 kids, his 3 grandchildren. And he's due to come and stay with us for Christmas. And he got very angry about me writing the book and told me I wasn't allowed to and I had no right to, and with a lot of swear words kind of thrown in. And I said, no, I'm going to write this story. I have every right to write this story. And he stormed out. I haven't seen him since.
Wow.
Or my brother, because my brother has always, as the golden child, been very aligned with my parents. But I don't really blame my brother. I mean, I would like to think that had it been the other way around, I would have been more caring of the child who was kind of obviously the black sheep. But it wasn't my brother who decided any of this. This was kind of my parents who decided it, not him.
And the reality is your brother's experience at that time is very different to yours, and he was a child himself. But I think you can grow up in the same household and have a very different experience to your sibling, especially when there's these dynamics where there's a golden child and potential narcissism carrying on and everything else. In terms of when you made the decision to write the book and knowing how much your family were against it, how did you rationalize with that? Because it would have taken a great amount of strength to go, okay, I know everybody who was there and also experienced this doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
So to start with, I didn't know that they didn't want to do it. In fact, they were. So when I first told them I was going to write it, I think they assumed I was going to write their version. And they actually let me kind of borrow all of their kind of papers, which I copied and gave back to them. And I think they assumed I was going to write their version because they'd always refused to talk to me about anything. So their version was the only version that was allowable, which was my father was a hero. It was all the kind of wonderful thing. And anyway, it all worked out fantastically because I went to Oxford. So, what was there to complain about? I think it was only during the writing process that it became, and they never actually said until that last kind of encounter with my father, don't write it. They just clearly were getting more nervous about it, I think. But as they were getting more nervous, I was getting much clearer about the story because I was reading all this and kind of reliving it. So I was becoming kind of clearer and clearer. I think the kind of question that was in my head, which I think goes through the head of a lot of people who are writing a book like this, is how honest should I be? So there's a spectrum, as it were, of writing a kind of candy floss version where you don't really confront anything and it becomes a bit of a travel log in my case, through to something which is really vitriolic. And the first version that I wrote, I remember I gave it to somebody and they said, well, it's really interesting, Suzanne, but what's really odd about this book is your mother is not in this book. And I realized that what I'd done in an attempt to try and make it palatable to my parents was I'd written my mother out of the story. So she was on the boat, but she never did anything because, of course, it was my mother who was most unpleasant to me. And what that made me realize is I can't cheat the reader like that. The reader notices. I mean, that's kind of, you've got to be honest. On the other hand, the book, and I think if people read the book's not at all vitriolic. I mean, the book just kind of, in a very neutral way, just explains what happened as we went on. And anyway, I didn't feel vitriolic when I was a child. I was just dealing with the universe that I was being presented with. So by the time it became clear that my parents were going to be very difficult about it, I was absolutely clear I was going to write it. I had every right to kind of write it. I wasn't writing it in a nasty way, but they couldn't stop me. I mean, they'd taken this decision to take me to sea and to basically take away my whole childhood. I have the right to tell that story in my own words.
How do you feel now in terms of, I mean, it's a really big conversation, that the fact that children don't have consent and that parents have to make the decisions that are the best decisions that they feel for their kids. And I mean, there's a lot of expectation that parents are going to make the right decisions. I think most parents want to do the right thing by their children. But then in your experience, there are parents who disregard what is best for their kids and prioritize what's best themselves. How do you, I mean, what is your interpretation of this now in terms of children and consent and how it's informed how you raised your children, like what impact that has had for you?
So there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think parents need to realize that most kids, not every kid, because every generalization is kind of incorrect in some instances, but most kids want to be normal. Most kids want to grow up and have friends and kind of be normal. And as most people will remember from their own childhoods, it's actually horrible to be a child and not be normal. Because you're bullied and people mock you. It was very difficult in those different bits when I went to school because I was always so weird, So kids want to be normal. So the motivations behind a parent kind of doing something extraordinary are often very, they come from a very good place, but they need to understand that the motivations for the child are very different and the impact on the child is very different. You as an adult deciding to step out of normal life and go and live in the outback or kind of go and, on a beach in the Seychelles or take a boat or whatever it is, your motivation is because you want to take a break from normal life or you even want to leave normal life. And that's a decision that you're taking kind of knowing what that is. The child, you're affecting their entire future. And there's only a certain period of your life where you are a parent with a dependent child. I mean, I know it feels like it goes on for a long time, but it's really only 15 years out of an adult's life where you've got that kind of dependency. So that's the kind of first thing. And then I think for everybody who's not the parent, I just think we need to be more questioning. It reminds me a little bit of those kind of signs that you now see in airports where they say, kind of ask if somebody's a kind of slave. There's something about just ask people the question. As you know, Instagram is full of parents putting out pictures of kind of them and their kids walking along the sandy beach or kind of, living in the middle of nowhere or going on a boat or whatever. I think we all need to question that. I don't think we should just assume that that's always a good thing. And that applies both to kind of, friends and family, but also to authorities. It still shocks me that nobody ever asked whether we were okay in this entire time.
I mean, it happens a lot. I think that now there's a little bit more of a lens of curiosity. I think not even just curiosity, but there's a standard that is held, and I think about this in terms of like domestic violence. People do ask more questions, but
still
not
enough.
enough. There's people don't want to overstep. But I even think about, when we were in school, there wasn't the framework for teachers to ask the right questions if they thought something was not right in a household. Whereas now teachers are taught what are the things to look out for. There's taught how do you approach these conversations with kids. And when you sort of say people that are living these kind of exciting lives, so to say, on social media. I mean, there was the family who had their entire family aboard a boat and the youngest child fell overboard and passed away, and they've been banned from ever living on a boat again. I don't know if I'd find the specific details of the story, but when you actually hear about the circumstances of which that family were living, it seems outrageous that ever was a possibility, and that it took an immense tragedy for that to come to an end.
Well, one thing that has happened since Wavewalker came out is because the book has done so well, I've been approached by many people who've had some sort of extraordinary childhood, or I've been introduced to them, or I've kind of come across them. And there are many different versions of this story. I mean, there are kids out there, absolutely, who have a wonderful time. And normally that's because the time period is not so long. You come from a kind of very caring family. They do make provision for you to have kind of friendships and schooling and so on. So that can all work out very well. But unfortunately, there are a lot of cases where it doesn't. And then it's kind of covered up. And your example of the kind of family where someone drowned, I mean, in a lot of these other cases, there were examples of kind of drowning or near drowning that takes place. I mean, frankly, a lot of these worlds where you can live kind of off grid, they are more dangerous. So you have to be very careful. But unfortunately, some of the parents who have the mindset of stepping outside of society don't have that sort of kind of caution and child protective in mind.
Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's truly fascinating, and I've never, ever come across anything quite like it. I cannot wait to see this adaptation for the series. Your memoir, Wavewalker, a memoir of breaking free, was released in 2023. Anyone that wants to go and read it, we're going to put all the links for it, but we cannot wait to see the series.
Thank you. It's going to be fantastic and wonderful to talk to you both today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming and being part of the pod, Susan. It's been amazing.
Thank you.